The wind in Juniper Gap had teeth. In the late autumn of 1887, it bit with a grit of red desert sand and the fine, forgotten dust of a silver mine that had given up its ghost. The drought had sucked the life from Cottonwood Creek, leaving a cracked, pale scar across the valley floor. And the town itself seemed to be shrinking, pulling in on itself against the ceaseless wind. It was a place holding its breath, waiting for either rain or ruin. Maeve Callahan tasted the grit on her lips and narrowed her eyes, the lines around them etched not just by 22 years under the Wyoming sun, but by a stubbornness so deep it was in her bones. She stood beside her lead mule, patting the coarse hair of his neck, her voice a low murmur against the wind's howl. Callahan Freight. It was just 2 wagons and a dozen mules. But it was hers, her father. The best teamster this side of the Laramie Range had left her with his name, his skills, and a mountain of debt his pride had never allowed him to speak of. Maeve's goal was as simple and hard as the land itself, pay off every last cent her mother owed. Then buy that patch of earth by the cottonwood, the one with the deep well, and build a proper livery and freight house, a place to stand firm. Across the dusty Main Street, Sheriff Elias Boone watched from the doorway of his office. He was a quiet man, his face a roadmap of sorrows he kept to himself. A widower they called the Gentle Sheriff, a title that some men mistook for weakness, usually only once. He'd seen enough violence in the war between the states to last a lifetime, and his only aim now was to keep Juniper Gap from sliding into the kind of lawlessness that greed always brought. He saw Maeve Callahan, a lone woman wrestling a man's world into submission, and he saw a spirit as untamed as the territory. His gaze shifted to the man exiting the telegraph office. Calder Pike. Pike was all tailored Eastern wool and polished boots, the owner of the defunct mine and the contractor for the new railroad spur. He moved with an air of ownership, as if the whole valley were already a deed in his pocket. He smiled at the townsfolk, a practiced, charming motion that never reached his eyes. Pike wanted the land and, more importantly, the water rights along Cottonwood Creek. He spoke of progress, of a new ore stamping mill. But Boone, who believed in the law but understood men better, smelled the familiar rot of ambition that would poison the ground to get what it wanted. At Pike's heels, like a loyal hound, was Deputy Len Rusk. Rusk wore his badge like a shield and his pistol like a threat. His loyalty was not to the law Boone served, but to the money Pike paid. He caught Boone's eye and gave a slight, mocking nod before following Pike toward the saloon. Inside the boarding house, Nora Dove, a woman whose heart was as warm as the stew she perpetually stirred, wiped a thick ceramic mug. Her tongue was as sharp as her coffee was strong, and she worried over Maeve like a mother hen. She was talking to Dr. Ames, the town's physician, a man whose cynical humor was the only medicine he gave for free. He considered himself the town's conscience, a role no one had asked him to play but which he performed with theatrical flair. "That girl will work herself into an early grave," Nora said, gesturing with her chin toward the street. Dr. Ames squinted through the grimy window. "Nonsense. Nora, stubbornness is a preservative. Pickles a soul right up. Look at me." A flash of movement caught his eye. Little Tom, a 14-year-old cattle herder with more energy than sense, darted across the street, waving a piece of licorice at Maeve. The boy worshipped her, trailing her like a shadow whenever he was in town, fetching water for her mules and chattering about his dream of one day driving a freight wagon himself. Maeve ruffled his hair, a rare, unguarded smile softening her features for a moment. The smile vanished as she looked toward the telegraph office. Miss Fairchild, Pike's secretary, stood on the boardwalk, her gaze cool and assessing. She was a woman who used ledgers and telegraph keys like weapons, her efficiency a cold, hard wall. She and Maeve exchanged a look that was pure iron striking flint. The sky, which had been a hazy, bleached blue all day, began to change. A yellowish-brown stain appeared on the western horizon, growing with unnatural speed, the wind always present, dropped into an eerie silence. The air grew thick, heavy. "Dust," Boone said, his voice low. He stepped out of his office, his eyes on the approaching wall of dirt. "Get inside. Tie down anything loose." Maeve had already turned to her wagon. This was a special run. A locked crate of mining tools Pike's company was shipping to a survey camp. The pay was good. Too good. But Maeve had learned not to question money when it was offered. She checked the ropes lashing the heavy wooden box to the wagon bed, pulling the knots tighter. Little Tom scrambled to help, his small hands working alongside hers. Then the world ended. The storm hit not like weather, but like a physical blow. A roaring wave of red sand and darkness swallowed the town whole. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The wind screamed. A high, thin shriek that tore at the ears and drove sand into every pore, every seam, every breath. Maeve fought to hold her team, the mules panicking, their brays lost in the gale. She could feel the wagon bucking behind her, the weight of the crate making it top-heavy and unstable. She was nearing the edge of town, the wagon wheels sinking into the soft dirt track that led past the dry creek bed. The world was a maelstrom of stinging grit and noise. A sudden, violent gust hit the wagon broadside. Maeve felt the lurch, the sickening tilt. The world spun, a blur of brown and gray. There was the splintering crack of wood, the scream of a mule, and then a heavy, final crash as the wagon tipped over the edge of the arroyo, landing on its side with a ground-shaking thud. Silence descended as quickly as the storm had come, leaving only the soft whisper of settling dust. The air began to clear, the sun a weak, hazy disk in a rust-colored sky. Maeve pushed herself up, coughing, her clothes and hair caked with a thick layer of red mud. One of the wagon wheels was shattered. The axle snapped, but it was the crate that drew her eye. It had been thrown clear of the wagon, its lid smashed open. Spilling out onto the sandy bottom of the creek bed were not mining tools, but dozens of heavy canvas bags. Each was stamped with the unmistakable eagle seal of the United States Treasury. Footsteps crunched in the sand behind her. Well, what have we here? Callahan. Deputy Len Rusk stood on the bank of the arroyo, a smug, satisfied grin spreading across his face. He had appeared out of the dust, as if summoned. "Looks like we found out where that missing Army payroll went," Rusk said, his hand already resting on the butt of his pistol. "Caught you red-handed." "I was hauling mining tools for Calder Pike," Maeve shot back, her voice raw. Her mind was reeling. "Payroll bags? This was not her cargo. This was a trap. This isn't my freight. You know it, Rusk!" "All I know is I see a thief in a wagon full of stolen government money," he sneered. "Starting to climb down into the creek bed? You're under arrest. Callahan." "Like hell I am." Maeve took a step back, her fists clenching. "That's enough, Len." Sheriff Boone's voice was calm, but it cut through Rusk's bluster like a sharp knife. He stood beside the deputy, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene, the wrecked wagon, the spilled money, Maeve's defiant stance. "Sheriff, she's a thief," Rusk insisted, pointing a trembling finger. "I got a telegraph from the district judge's office just before the storm. They've been tracking this shipment. It authorizes me to make an arrest on sight." Boone's eyes flickered toward Maeve. He saw the fury in her, but also the shock, the genuine confusion. He knew the district judge was in Cheyenne for another week. The telegraph was a lie. "Let's hear her side," Boone said evenly. "I was hired to haul a locked crate of tools," Maeve said, her voice shaking with rage. "I have a bill of lading to prove it. I don't know anything about this money." Rusk laughed. A likely story. Boone ignored him. He slid down the sandy bank and picked up one of the bags, weighing it in his hand. He looked at the broken crate, then back at Maeve, his gaze steady. He saw the red dust clinging to her clothes, a stain on her honor as plain as the dirt on her face. In the distance, the telegraph office bell gave a faint, sharp tick, like a clock counting down. "The judge is out of town. Len, Boone said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But an order is an order, even a questionable one. However, this is my town." He turned to Maeve. "I can't ignore this, but I'm not convinced of your guilt. I will give you 72 hours, 3 days. You find proof that you were set up, that this cargo isn't what you were told. You bring me something solid. If you can't, then I'll have no choice but to honor the warrant and lock you up myself." Rusk sputtered in protest, but Boone silenced him with a look. It was more than Maeve had expected, but it was also a death sentence. 3 days to fight a ghost, to battle a lie sent over a wire by an invisible hand. The sheriff and his deputy gathered the money bags and hauled them back to town, leaving Maeve alone with the wreckage of her wagon and her life. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley. Kneeling in the sand, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest, she ran her hand along the inside of the broken crate. Her fingers came away with a fine, gritty black powder clinging to them. It looked like coal dust, maybe, but it felt greasy, and it carried a faint, sharp, chemical smell, an odor that spoke not of mines or forges, but of something else entirely. Something wrong. She looked at the stain on her fingertips, then toward the distant, darkening shape of Calder Pike's stamping mill. 72 hours. The clock was ticking. The walk back to town was a long one, each step a grinding reminder of the 3 days ticking away. Maeve left the ruined wagon where it lay. It was a problem for later. The only problem now was her name. She marched straight for the railroad depot, her face set like stone, the dust of the storm still clinging to her like a shroud. The freight office was a small, neat room smelling of ink and oiled wood, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Miss Fairchild looked up from a ledger as Maeve entered, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if a stray dog had wandered in. Sheriff Boone was already there, leaning against a counter, his presence filling the small space with a quiet authority. "I need to see the bill of lading for my last shipment," Maeve said, her voice flat and hard. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Miss Fairchild raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "All paperwork is in order. Miss Callahan, the crate was logged and dispatched according to procedure." "The procedure that listed its contents as mining tools," Maeve countered, stepping closer to the counter, because what was in that box was United States Treasury bags. A flicker of something, perhaps satisfaction, crossed the secretary's face before it was smoothed away into a mask of professional concern. "I can only attest to what is on the manifest. We do not inspect the contents of locked crates. That is the shipper's responsibility." She produced a sheet of paper from a drawer, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. As you can see, Maeve snatched the paper. It was a standard freight manifest, listing 1 crate. Contents noted as specialized mining implements, signed by a foreman from Pike's operation. But it was the official-looking stamp at the bottom, an imprint of the county seal meant to expedite its passage. That drew her eye. It was blurry, the ink smudged. Boone pushed himself off the counter and took the paper from her hand, holding it up to the light from the window. He ran a thumb over the seal. "This ink is still damp," he said, his voice neutral. "And the eagle's left wing is missing a feather. The real county seal is flawless." He looked directly at Miss Fairchild, his gaze unwavering. "This is a forgery, a poor one at that." Miss Fairchild's composure did not crack. "I am not a government official. Sheriff, I am a clerk. I process the papers I am given." She took the manifest back from him and placed it neatly in its file. "If you have an issue with Mr. Pike's paperwork, I suggest you take it up with him. Now, if you will excuse me, the afternoon train is due." She turned back to her ledger. A clear dismissal. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the air thick with hanging dust. "She is lying," Maeve said, kicking at a loose stone on the boardwalk. "She knows everything." "Knowing and proving are 2 different trails, Miss Callahan," Boone replied. "And yours is running out of time." Maeve left him there and walked toward Nora Dove's boarding house, the one place in town that felt like a sanctuary. The scent of beef stew and strong coffee met her at the door. Nora stood at the stove, a formidable woman with flour on her apron and kindness in her eyes. She took one look at Maeve's face and ladled a thick, steaming portion of stew into a bowl. "Sit," she commanded, "and for goodness' sake, stop looking like you are about to declare war on the whole world. A little less vinegar in your veins might do you some good." Dr. Ames sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee in his hand. He watched Boone enter a moment after Maeve and take a seat at another table. "Pay her no mind. Sheriff," the doctor said with a wry grin, "Nora's stew could soothe the devil himself. As for you," he added, his sharp eyes on Boone, "you have the expression of a man chewing on nails for breakfast. Do try to relax. Your face may be as hard as a butcher's block, but we all know your heart is soft as melted butter." Boone offered a small, tired smile, but said nothing. He watched Maeve, who was wolfing down her stew as if she had not eaten in a week. Her pride was a wall around her, thick and high. He got up and walked over to her table. "You do not have to fight this alone," he said quietly. Maeve looked up, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Her first instinct was to tell him to go to hell, to tell him she had never needed anyone's help, and she did not plan on starting now. "I have handled my own fights my whole life." "Sheriff," she said, her voice tight. "And you have done a fine job of it," he acknowledged. "But this is not a fist fight in a saloon. This is Calder Pike. His kind of fight uses whispers and forged papers, not knuckles." "I will manage," she said, turning back to her stew, her shoulders rigid. He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded and walked out. Maeve finished her meal in silence, the warmth of the food doing little to quell the cold knot of fear in her stomach. She thanked Nora and went to leave, but stopped at the doctor's table on her way out. "Dr. Ames," she began, her voice low. "My mother, her cough is worse. I need another bottle of your tonic." The doctor's humorous expression softened. He knew Maeve's mother was a frail woman, and he knew Maeve's freight business was the only thing keeping them afloat. "Of course, Maeve, but you know, your account is getting quite long." He said it gently, without judgment. The words hit her harder than Rusk's accusation. The debt, the tonic, her mother's health, all of it depended on her clearing her name, on keeping Callahan Freight in business. Her pride was a luxury she could not afford. Swallowing hard, she turned and walked out the door, her boots heavy on the boardwalk. She found Boone standing by the water trough, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. "All right, Sheriff," she said, coming to a stop beside him. "You want to help? Then help." Before he could answer, a rumble echoed through the valley, low and menacing. It was not the sound of the train. It was thunder. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now bruised with dark, angry clouds that had seemingly appeared from nowhere. A sudden freak storm. A man came running up the street, his face pale with panic. "It is a flash flood. The creek, my wagon is stuck, and my kids are in it." The dry bed of Cottonwood Creek was suddenly a raging torrent of brown, churning water, carrying rocks and debris with it. A small farm wagon was caught in the middle of the deluge, its wheels mired in the mud, the water rising rapidly around it. 2 small children were clinging to the wagon seat, their faces masks of terror. Maeve did not hesitate. She was already running, Boone right beside her. The force of the water was immense, pulling at their legs, threatening to sweep them away. They fought their way to the wagon. Maeve grabbed the younger child, a little girl no older than 5, while Boone took the boy. "We have to get the wagon out or it will be smashed to pieces," Maeve yelled over the roar of the water. Working together, they unhitched the terrified horses and led them to the bank. Then, with Maeve shouting directions learned from a lifetime of dealing with stuck wagons, they used the horses and ropes to haul the heavy vehicle from the sucking mud, pulling it free just as a massive log swept past where it had been moments before. They got the children and the wagon back to their grateful father. The little girl was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering from cold and fear. Without a second thought, Maeve took off her own heavy canvas coat and wrapped it around the child, pulling her into a tight, comforting hug and murmuring soft words until the trembling subsided. Boone watched her, and in that moment, he saw past the defiant, argumentative woman the town knew. He saw the heart she kept hidden behind her walls of pride. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a setting sun that painted the wet ground in shades of gold and orange. They stood on the creek bank, soaked and breathing heavily. "I am stubborn," Maeve said, as if in answer to his unspoken thoughts. "Not stupid." A slow smile touched Boone's lips. "The difference is as thin as a razor's edge," he said, his voice laced with a newfound warmth. "But it is a difference." Their moment of shared understanding was shattered by the arrival of Deputy Rusk, who came swaggering toward them, a triumphant look on his face. "Sheriff, you will want to see this," he said, holding up something small and metallic. "I was doing a final inventory of the contents of Callahan's wagon, her personal effects, found this tucked away in her tool chest." He opened his hand. Lying on his palm was a heavy gold signet ring, bearing the unmistakable eagle seal of the United States Treasury. Maeve stared at it, her blood running cold. "I have never seen that before in my life," she whispered. "Funny," Rusk sneered. "It had your name on it." He looked at Boone, his eyes glinting with malice. "Looks like your 72 hours just got a whole lot shorter." "Callahan." Boone looked from the ring in Rusk's hand to the furious, desperate denial in Maeve's eyes. He had seen men plant evidence before. He knew the look of a liar, and he knew the look of a cornered animal. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that Maeve Callahan was no liar. Rusk, on the other hand, was another story entirely. Boone took the ring from Rusk's palm, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not look at Maeve. He looked at his deputy, a long, quiet look that seemed to take the man's measure and find him wanting. "Evidence goes in the safe. Len, not on public display." He closed his fingers around the ring, his voice dropping to a low command. "Go on now. I will handle this." Rusk hesitated, the triumph draining from his face, replaced by a sullen resentment. He gave a curt nod and stalked back toward the main street, his back rigid with indignation. When he was gone, Boone turned to Maeve. Her face was a pale, tight mask of fury. "He planted it," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "That snake planted it." "I believe you," Boone said simply. The words hung in the air, a small, solid weight of trust in a world that had suddenly turned to sand. "But believing is not enough. Come with me." He led her not to a cell, but to his office, inside. The small room was an island of order. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of law books, and a map of the county tacked to the wall. He unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick folder. He spread the contents across the blotter. They were debt notices, dozens of them, all filed by Calder Pike's company against small landowners and prospectors up and down Cottonwood Creek. "Pike has been buying up debt, forcing foreclosures," Boone explained, his finger tracing a line on one of the documents. "He says it is just business. But look here." He pointed to the county seal stamped at the bottom of each notice. They were all slightly different, yet all shared the same flaw, a smudged edge, a faint blurring, just like the one on Maeve's forged bill of lading. "He has got someone making these for him, someone sloppy, or someone who thinks no one is smart enough to look closely." Maeve stared at the papers, the scope of Pike's plan beginning to dawn on her. It was not just about framing her. It was about the whole valley. "He wants the water," she said, looking up at him. "All of it." "That is my guess," Boone agreed. "And whatever he is planning, he needs it clear of people." That night, under the sliver of a moon, they rode out of town, not on the main road, but through the sagebrush, their horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. They circled around toward Pike's new stamping mill, a skeletal structure of new timber that loomed dark against the star-dusted sky. A single lantern burned in a watchman's shack, but the man was asleep, his chair tilted back, his snores a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. They slipped inside the main building. The air was thick with the smell of new machinery and something else, a sharp, almond-like odor that pricked the back of the throat. In the dim moonlight filtering through the high windows, they saw it. Not the familiar crushers and separators of a silver mill, but large wooden vats and a complex network of pipes. Stacked against one wall were dozens of heavy wooden barrels, each stenciled with a skull and crossbones and the word cyanide. Maeve ran a hand over one of the barrels, a cold dread seeping into her. She had heard whispers of this new process, a way to leach every last speck of silver from low-grade ore using a powerful poison. Boone pointed toward the back of the mill. A large, powerful-looking pump was connected to a wide pipe that led out through the rear wall and was aimed directly down the gentle slope toward the banks of Cottonwood Creek. "He is not just going to use the water," Boone said, his voice grim. "He is going to poison it." As they turned to leave, Maeve's blue neckerchief, a small comfort she always wore, caught on the exposed gear of a drive shaft. It pulled tight, choking her. She gave a small, strangled gasp. In a single, fluid motion, Boone was there. He drew his knife and sliced through the fabric, pulling her back against him. The machine whined softly as the torn blue cloth was pulled deeper into its teeth. For a moment they stood frozen, his hand on her arm, the shared danger a palpable thing between them. Her pride, the very thing that made her so fiercely independent, had almost gotten her killed. His quick, quiet competence had saved her. The torn scarf felt like a small surrender. The next day, Maeve found little Tom sweeping the boardwalk in front of the depot. "Tom," she said, keeping her voice casual, "you know your way around that telegraph machine, don't you?" The boy's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am, I help, mister. Henderson send messages all the time. I know the code and everything." "I need you to look something up for me," she said, leading him into the now empty telegraph office. "I need to know exactly when that message from the district judge came in for Deputy Rusk. The one about the Army payroll." Tom's eyes went wide, but he asked no questions. He pulled the heavy logbook from its shelf and ran his finger down the columns of handwritten entries. He traced the lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he stopped. He looked up at Maeve, his expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. "That is funny. Miss Callahan," he said, "there is no incoming message for Deputy Rusk from the district court any time yesterday." He turned the book around for her to see, "But there is this, an outgoing message, sent the night before the dust storm, paid for by Mr. Pike's account." He pointed to the destination code. It was not the district court. It was an office down the line, a relay station. But the operator's signature was Clear M. Fairchild, and the message itself was logged as an urgent law enforcement matter to be routed back to Juniper Gap as if it were an official directive. "She sent it herself," Maeve breathed, the final piece clicking into place. "She faked the whole thing." Maeve felt a surge of white-hot anger. She wanted to storm into Pike's office, slap the logbook down on his polished desk, and watch his smug composure crumble. She found Boone by the livery, checking the shoe on his horse. "We have got him," she said, her voice trembling with a fierce energy. "Fairchild sent the telegram herself. It is all in the logbook. I'm going to go in there and do what Boone interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Show them our only piece of solid evidence so they can burn the book and say the boy is lying. No, we have a lead, a strong one, but proof needs to be built, brick by brick, until it is a wall they cannot knock down." "A wall takes too long to build," she argued, stepping right up to him. "I have less than 2 days before you have to lock me up. Your way is too slow, Sheriff." "And your way is too fast," he countered, his eyes holding hers. "You will run straight into a trap, and you will take our only chance with you. We need more than the logbook. We need to connect that crate to Pike's mill." Frustrated, but seeing the undeniable logic in his words, Maeve fell silent. She remembered the black powder from the inside of the broken crate. She had a small sample of it wrapped in a piece of cloth in her pocket. "The dust," she said. "The black dust in the crate." They went to the one man in town who might know what it was. Dr. Ames was in his office, cleaning his spectacles. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression shifting from mild amusement to serious concern. Maeve unfolded the cloth and showed him the dark, greasy powder. The doctor peered at it, then touched a small amount to his tongue, a gesture that made Maeve flinch. He spat immediately into a basin. He sniffed it, then rolled a bit between his fingers. "Well, now," he said, wiping his fingers on his coat, "this is not your average coal dust or road dirt." He looked up at them, his eyes sharp and serious behind his clean lenses. "This is charcoal. Yes, finely ground, but it has been used to absorb something volatile." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Given the smell coming off Pike's new folly and the barrels you saw, I would stake my medical license on it. This is charcoal dust saturated with cyanide residue." The meaning was clear and damning. The moneybags had not just been near the mill, the crate itself, the very box Maeve had been hired to haul, must have been stored inside the processing area, right where Pike was working with his poison. They walked out of the doctor's office into the fading light of evening. For the first time, Maeve felt a sliver of hope. It was a tangible link, a piece of physical proof. As they cut through the alley behind the general store, two figures stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. They were rough men, strangers, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Sheriff," one of them said, his voice a low growl. "Miss Fairchild sends her regards. She says you have been asking too many questions." Boone pushed Maeve slightly behind him, his body shielding hers. His own hand moved slowly, not toward his gun, but held out in a placating gesture. "There is no need for trouble, boys." "We are the trouble," the second man sneered, and he drew his gun. Boone did not draw his own. "Instead," he said, his voice ringing with an odd, calm authority, "I am going to count to 3. Then I am going to shoot the man on the right. 1. The men hesitated, thrown by his strange confidence. 2. The man on the right flinched, his eyes darting nervously. Boone never said 3. As the gunman's attention wavered, he dropped low and drew his pistol in a blur of motion, firing not at the man, but at the ground just in front of his feet. Dirt and gravel exploded upwards. The man yelped and stumbled back, momentarily blinded. At the same instant, a loud crack, sharper than a gunshot, split the air. Maeve had uncoiled the long leather bullwhip she always carried tucked in her belt. The whip snaked out, wrapping around the second man's gun hand, and she yanked hard. The pistol flew from his grasp and clattered across the alley. They did not wait for the men to recover. Boone grabbed Maeve's hand and they ran, turning down another narrow passage and out onto the main street, not stopping until they reached the relative safety of the sheriff's office. They leaned against the door, breathing hard, their hearts pounding. It was then that Maeve saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of Boone's left arm. "You are hit," she said, her voice tight with alarm. He looked down at his arm, as if noticing it for the first time. A bullet had torn a deep, bloody furrow along his bicep. "It is just a scratch," he said, but his face was pale, and a fine sheen of sweat was beading on his forehead. They did not dare go back to the sheriff's office or the boarding house. Pike's men would be watching. Instead, Boone, leaning more heavily on Maeve than he would ever admit, guided her toward the edge of town, to a low, grassy rise where a long abandoned horse barn stood silhouetted against the bruised purple of the evening sky. Just as they reached its rickety doors, the clouds that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. Inside, the barn smelled of ancient hay. damp earth, and the ghosts of horses. Rain hammered on the shake roof, a deafening but welcome sound that shut out the rest of the world. Maeve eased Boone down onto a pile of relatively clean straw in an empty stall. In the gloom, she could see the stark white of his face, the dark patch of his bloodied sleeve a terrible contrast. "We need to get that shirt off," she said, her voice more brusque than she intended. A clumsy attempt to hide the tremor of fear in her hands. "And I need light." She found an old, rust-eaten lantern and, after a few tries with the flint and steel from her pouch, managed to coax a weak, flickering flame to life. The soft yellow light pushed the shadows back, creating a small, intimate circle of warmth in the vast, dark space. Boone had managed to shrug out of his coat and was now struggling with the buttons on his shirt. His movements were clumsy, his good hand uncoordinated. "Here," Maeve said, kneeling in front of him. "Stop fussing before you make it worse." Her fingers, usually so sure and steady on the reins of a mule team, felt thick and awkward as she worked the small buttons free. She peeled the damp, blood-soaked cotton away from his arm. The wound was ugly, a deep gouge that was still oozing blood. It was not a clean shot through, but a long, ragged tear where the bullet had sliced along the muscle. "It needs to be cleaned," she muttered, more to herself than to him. She looked around the dilapidated barn, her frustration growing. "And I have nothing?" "Saddlebag," Boone said, his voice a low rasp. "There is a flask, whiskey, and a roll of bandage." She retrieved the items. The whiskey would have to do. Tearing a piece of cloth from her own petticoat, she soaked it in the liquor. "This is going to sting," she warned. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes closed. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch surprisingly light. He flinched but made no sound. As she worked, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. A fever was already setting in. She bandaged the arm tightly, her knots firm and practical. With the immediate danger dealt with, a new kind of helplessness set in. She was a teamster, a freighter. She knew how to fix a broken axle, how to calm a spooked mule, how to navigate by the stars. She did not know how to care for a sick man. He was shivering now, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. She covered him with her own dry coat and the one horse blanket she found, but it did not seem to be enough. She built a small, contained fire in the middle of the dirt floor, the smoke finding its way out through the gaps in the roof. She used her tin cup to boil rainwater she collected from a drip, adding a pinch of the bitter willow bark her father had taught her to use for aches and pains in the livestock. It was a poor substitute for the doctor's medicine, but it was all she had. She propped his head up so he could drink. He swallowed the bitter concoction without complaint, then sank back into the straw, his eyes hazy. The rain droned on, a steady, hypnotic rhythm on the roof. The fire crackled. In the quiet intimacy of their small shelter, the high walls of Maeve's defenses began to crumble. She found herself talking, her voice low, filling the silence. "My father, he taught me to drive when I was 10, she began, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "We were hauling groceries for a big outfit out of Cheyenne. He would let me take the reins on the flat stretches. Said I had a better feel for the team than any man he ever hired." She paused, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. He was a proud man, too proud to admit when things got bad. When the railroad started taking all the good contracts. She fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the rain and Boone's shallow breathing. "My mother," she continued, the words coming harder now. She worked in a saloon before she met my father. The people in this town, they have long memories for things like that. They look at her, and they still see the saloon girl. They look at me, and they see her daughter. They whisper, they always have. That is why I have to make it. Why I have to pay off the debt, build the livery, to prove them all wrong, to show them that the Callahan name means something, that we are not what they say we are." She had never told anyone this, not in its entirety. She had lived it, breathed it, let it shape her into the hard, prickly woman the whole town saw, but she had never given it voice. Saying the words aloud in the quiet dark felt like lancing a wound of her own. Boone was watching her, his eyes surprisingly clear through the fever's haze. He had been listening to every word. When she finally fell silent, he shifted in the straw, his breath catching in a pained sigh. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing against hers. His voice was a dry, fevered whisper, but it carried across the small space with perfect clarity. Too stubborn, too arrogant, they said. Yet the gentle sheriff called her the tenderest soul he knew. Maeve frowned, pulling her hand back as if startled. The words were a soft blow, unexpected and disarming. "Who said that?" she asked, her voice sharp with confusion. A faint smile touched Boone's lips, a weary but genuine thing. "I did," he whispered. "Just now." She stared at him, her heart doing a strange, stuttering dance in her chest. All her life, she had been defined by her hardness, her defiance. People called her stubborn, arrogant, difficult. She had embraced the labels, worn them like armor, because it was better to be feared than to be pitied. But he had looked right through the armor. In the middle of a fever, wounded and in danger, he had seen something no one else had ever bothered to look for. He saw the girl who wrapped her own coat around a shivering child, the daughter who fought a whole town for her mother's honor. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Maeve Callahan felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, turning her face away from the firelight. The strongest wall she had ever built, the one around her own heart, had just been breached without a single shot fired. She allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she was not alone in this fight. After a long silence, she turned back to him, a wry, shaky smile on her own lips. "When you are lucid tomorrow, Sheriff," she said, her voice almost steady, "remember to deny you ever said that." His eyes were half closed now, the fever and exhaustion pulling him under. But his faint smile remained. "If I deny it," he murmured, his words slurring slightly, "will you make me drink more of that terrible medicine?" She let out a small, quiet laugh. It felt foreign, but good. She settled back on her heels, watching him as he finally drifted into a restless sleep. The rain was letting up, the drumming on the roof softening to a gentle patter. A fragile peace settled over the old barn. The peace was shattered by the sound of a horse, ridden hard, splashing through the mud outside. Maeve was on her feet in an instant, her hand on the bullwhip at her belt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The barn door creaked open, and a small, frantic figure was silhouetted against the pre-dawn gray. It was little Tom. He was soaked to the skin and gasping for breath, his eyes wide with panic. "Miss Callahan," he cried, stumbling into the barn. "You have to run. You have to hide Deputy Rusk. He went to the circuit magistrate over in Harmony Creek. He got a new warrant, a federal one. He is telling everyone you are part of a gang that robbed the army. He is coming at sunrise. He is going to search everything. Your wagons, your mother's house, everything." The boy's words dropped into the quiet barn like stones into a still pond. Sunrise, a federal warrant, a search of everything she held dear. Maeve felt a cold fury that burned away the last of her fear. They were done running. They were done reacting. "He is not just trying to frame me anymore," she said, her voice a low, hard thing. "He is trying to erase me, erase Callahan Freight, my mother, everything." She looked at Boone, who was pushing himself into a sitting position, his face pale, but his eyes clear and sharp. "Your way is too slow. Sheriff, we do not have 10 days. We do not even have until morning. We have to set a trap of our own, and we have to set it now." Boone winced as he shifted his weight. "What kind of trap?" "A loud one," she answered, her mind racing, clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. "Pike uses the telegraph as a weapon. It is time we fired back." She turned to little Tom, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. "Tom, I need you to send a message. A fake one. I'm going to write it out for you. It will say that Callahan Freight is making a secret run tonight, a shipment of high-grade gold ore from the old Starfall claim. Heading east, the route will be through Devil's Notch. Boone shook his head. Maeve, that is a dead end. Pike's men will have you cornered with no way out. They will not be cornering me, she countered, a grim smile touching her lips. Because the wagon will be empty. But Pike's men do not know that. They will hear gold ore, and they will come running. You and I will be waiting for them, up on the ridge. We will see them, identify them. We will have witnesses to Pike's attempted robbery. It will be enough to get a real judge to listen. It is too dangerous, Boone insisted. Those men from the alley, they shoot first. Then you will have to be ready to shoot back, she said flatly. I will not kill anyone. Maeve, he said, his voice firm, the one principle he would not bend. We will do this, but we do it my way. We will disarm them, disable them, but no one dies. She looked at the stubborn set of his jaw, at the unwavering conviction in his eyes. She was asking him to put his life on the line for her, based on her reckless plan. He was agreeing, but only on his terms. All right, Sheriff, she said, the words a concession and a promise, no killing. They left Tom with instructions to send the message in 1 hour, giving it the appearance of a rushed secret dispatch, then slip away unseen. They made their way through the back alleys, moving through the pre-dawn gloom to the one place they knew they would be safe, Nora Dove's kitchen. Nora opened the back door before they even knocked, a heavy iron skillet in her hand. She took one look at Boone's pale face and the bloody bandage, and her expression softened from suspicion to fierce concern. Get him inside, she ordered, hustling them into the warm, fragrant kitchen. Dr. Ames was already there, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, as if he had been expecting them. Let me see that, the doctor said, foregoing his usual witty banter. He unwrapped Maeve's clumsy bandage and clicked his tongue at the angry-looking wound. Clean. For a battlefield dressing, but it needs stitches. While Nora bustled about, fetching hot water and clean linen, the doctor set to work, his movements quick and efficient. Boone sat stoically at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, as the needle pierced his skin. You are in luck, the doctor said as he tied off the last stitch. The bullet stayed out, but you have lost blood, and you will have a fever for a day or two. Any more running around is a fool's errand. He looked from Boone to Maeve. I got a message out on the evening line. Before all this foolishness, there is a circuit judge, a man named Patterson, a hard but fair man. He is due at the county seat in 10 days. I told his clerk it was a matter of public health, a potential contamination of a water source. That got his attention. So you see, we do have a clock, a real one. 10 days felt like a lifetime. Maeve's trap was for tonight. Nora, meanwhile, had been working at a small table with a block of wax and a carving knife. She had a copy of a legitimate county document, one with a clear, crisp seal. That fool Pike. His forgeries are clumsy, she muttered, her hands surprisingly deft. He thinks money makes him clever. An honest seal has weight to it. His feels cheap. With Dr. Ames offering precise instructions, they were crafting a perfect replica of the official seal, a tool to prove the forgeries when the time came. As the sun began to rise, Maeve knew she had to move. Rusk would be starting his search. But first, there was one more piece she had to put in place. She walked to the railroad depot, the telegraph wire overhead humming faintly in the morning breeze, a nervous, high-strung sound, like a taut string about to snap. Miss Fairchild was at her desk, a picture of calm efficiency. She looked up as Maeve entered, her expression cool and unbothered. Miss Callahan, she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. I heard there was some trouble. I trust the sheriff is handling it. The sheriff is a little busy, thanks to your hired help, Maeve said, planting her hands on the counter. The two you sent into the alley last night. Not a flicker of emotion crossed Miss Fairchild's face. I have no idea what you are talking about. Let me be clearer, then, Maeve said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. You sent a fake telegram. You put stolen money in my wagon. You forged a county seal. You have done a lot of work for Calder Pike. Your accusations are baseless, Miss Fairchild said, her gaze like ice, and frankly, quite tiresome. Are they? Maeve smiled, a sharp, humorless expression. We will see what Judge Patterson thinks of them in 10 days. We will see what he thinks about your logbook, your forgeries, and the cyanide residue all over the crate you sent me to haul. She pushed herself back from the counter, turning to leave. At the door, she stopped and looked back. You know, for a woman involved in such a dirty business, you managed to keep yourself so clean. She held up her own hands, still grimy from the barn and the trail. My hands are filthy, but your hands are clean of ink. Miss Fairchild, the Cottonwood River is not. For the first time, Maeve saw a crack in the woman's perfect facade, a flicker of fear, quickly suppressed. But it was there. Maeve walked out into the morning light, leaving the chilling implication hanging in the air behind her. The town was a minefield of shifting loyalties. As she walked down the main street, she saw Rusk puffed up with his new federal authority, leading 2 deputies on a search of her empty freight yard. He saw her and grinned, a look of pure malice. Some townsfolk hurried past, their eyes averted, not wanting to be associated with her trouble. Others gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of support. She was no longer just Maeve Callahan. Teamster. She was a storm, and the town was dividing itself in her wake. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. This was her plan. If it went wrong, if Boone was hurt worse, it would be on her. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any freight she had ever hauled. That night, the air was cold and still. Devil's Notch was a narrow cut in the rock, a place of deep shadows and treacherous footing. Maeve had left one of her wagons, empty, at the entrance to the pass. She and Boone were hidden high above, concealed in a cluster of rocks on the ridge, a perfect vantage point. Boone was propped against a boulder, his face drawn with pain but his eyes alert, a rifle resting across his lap. They waited. The moon rose, casting the landscape in a stark silver and black. The minutes stretched into an hour. Then 2. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the rocks and the distant cry of a coyote. Nothing. No riders. No ambush. The trap was empty. A cold dread began to creep over Maeve. Something was wrong. Pike had not taken the bait. Why? Then they heard it. A low, mournful whistle, echoing through the hills. The train. That is the midnight freight, Boone said, his brow furrowed. It is 2 hours early. They looked at each other, the same unspoken question in their eyes. Then, from the east, in the direction of the railroad tracks, a faint orange glow began to stain the night sky. It grew brighter, pulsating, the light of a large, hungry fire. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of burning pine. Shadow Trestle, Maeve whispered, her blood running cold. The massive wooden bridge that spanned the deepest part of the canyon was in that direction. And then she understood, the pieces of Pike's real plan slamming into place in her mind with the force of a physical blow. The failed ambush, the early train, the fire. It was not a trap for her. It was a diversion. He wanted everyone, every able-bodied man in Juniper Gap, to be rushing out to fight the forest fire. And while they were gone, the early train, the one carrying his chemicals, would arrive. The fire would weaken the trestle, or maybe his men would finish the job. He was not trying to frame her anymore. He was going to send those cars of cyanide plunging into the creek, poisoning the water, the land, everything. He was going to kill the whole valley and buy the blighted land for pennies on the dollar. He is going to burn the bridge, she said, her voice shaking with the horror of the realization. He is going to poison the creek. There was no time to think, only to act. The orange glow to the east was no longer a glow. It was a hungry, roaring beast. and the wind, as if in league with Pike's malevolent plan, had shifted, driving the flames directly toward the skeletal silhouette of the shadow trestle. The train's whistle shrieked again, closer this time, a scream of iron and steam rushing toward destruction. "My horse," Maeve said, the words a harsh command. She scrambled down the rocky slope, Boone following, his movements stiff with pain but his face a mask of grim determination. She swung herself onto the back of Pepper, her sturdy gray gelding, his muscles already bunched with nervous energy. "Maeve, you cannot stop a train," Boone said, grabbing the bridle. "I am not stopping the train," she shot back, her eyes wild with a desperate fire that mirrored the one on the horizon. "I am breaking it." She pointed toward the tracks. "Those cyanide cars will be right behind the engine. I can uncouple them, but I need to get on board." He saw the unshakable resolve in her face and knew there was no arguing. He let go of the bridle. "I will cut across the canyon floor. Rusk will be there. Pike, too. They will not be expecting me. Do not get yourself killed." "Sheriff," she said, her voice softer for a moment. "I could say the same to you," he replied, and then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows. Maeve kicked Pepper into a gallop, the horse's powerful legs eating up the ground. She rode not toward the fire, but on a parallel course to the tracks, aiming for a long, straight stretch of land just before the trestle. The ground trembled as the engine thundered past her, a monstrous black shape belching smoke and cinders, its single headlight cutting a frantic, bouncing beam through the darkness. Behind it were the cars, a long, rumbling chain of them. She saw them immediately, 2 flatbed cars, their cargo hidden under heavy tarps, the stenciled image of a skull and crossbones just visible in the flickering firelight. The cyanide. She urged Pepper on, the horse running flat out, his breath coming in great, ragged bursts. They were gaining. The roar of the wheels on the track was a physical force, a wall of sound. Maeve pulled the heavy hammer from its loop on her saddle and took the spare coupling pin she always carried, a solid bar of iron, tucking it into her belt. She drew alongside the first cyanide car. Now, with a prayer caught in her throat, she kicked her feet free of the stirrups, gathered herself, and leaped. Her boots hit the narrow walkway at the edge of the flat car with a jarring thud. She stumbled, windmilled her arms for balance, and fell to her hands and knees. The motion of the train trying to drag her under its wheels, she clung to the rough wooden planks, her knuckles white, and slowly, carefully, pulled herself up. Below her, the ground blurred by in a terrifying rush. Ahead, the trestle loomed, its timbers already glowing, sparks and embers raining down on it from the inferno on the canyon rim. She had to work fast. She made her way to the back of the second car, the wind of their passage tearing at her clothes. The coupling was a heavy, greasy mechanism, the massive iron pin holding it in place held fast by the tension of the train. She used the hammer, the rhythmic clang of steel on the steel lost in the greater roar of the train and the fire. The pin was stuck fast. On the ground near the base of the trestle, Boone moved like a ghost through the firelit woods. He saw them, just as he knew he would. Deputy Len Rusk stood watching the approaching train, his face illuminated by the flames, a look of greedy anticipation on his features. Boone stepped out from behind a tree, his pistol in his hand. "It is over, Len," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the roar of the fire. Rusk spun around, his own gun appearing in his hand with surprising speed. "Boone, you should have stayed put. Pike pays better than the law." He fired, the shot going wide. Boone did not fire back. He moved, using the trees for cover, closing the distance. "There is nowhere for you to run." "I am not the one who needs to run," Rusk snarled, and fired again. This time, Boone answered. He did not aim for Rusk's chest. He aimed for his hand. The shot was perfect. Rusk's pistol flew from his grasp as if slapped by an invisible hand, and the deputy cried out, clutching his numbed fingers. Boone stepped into the clearing, his own gun leveled, I told you, it is over. Up on the train, Maeve gave the pin one last, desperate blow with the hammer. It shifted, groaning in protest, and then slid free, with a final heave. She pulled it out. The heavy coupling disengaged with a violent bang. The two cyanide cars, their momentum unchecked, began to slow, separating from the rest of the train which was already rumbling onto the burning trestle. But she was not alone. A figure stepped out from behind a tarp on the car. Calder Pike. His face was a mask of cold fury, his fine eastern suit smudged with soot. In his hand, he held a small, silver-plated derringer. "You have been a constant disappointment, Miss Callahan," he said, his voice almost conversational over the din. He raised the pistol, aiming it at her back as she fumbled with the heavy, squealing handbrake at the front of the car. At that moment, the trestle gave a great, groaning shudder. A support timber, eaten through by the fire, collapsed in a shower of sparks. The whole structure swayed. Pike, unprepared for the lurch, lost his footing. He cried out, a thin, reedy sound of pure terror, as he slid off the edge of the flat car, his fingers scrabbling for a handhold and finding none. He was dangling over the fiery chasm, his grip on the edge of the car the only thing keeping him from falling. Maeve saw it happen. She saw the man who had tried to destroy her, the man who was about to shoot her in the back, hanging helpless. Every instinct screamed to let him go, to let justice, in its most elemental form, be done. But she saw the terror in his eyes, and it was not the face of a monster, but of a pathetic, frightened man. She could not do it. She lunged forward, grabbed his wrist, and hauled him back onto the car with a strength born of pure adrenaline. He lay there, gasping, for a second, then his eyes narrowed, and the fear was replaced by pure, cold malice. He raised the derringer he had somehow managed to hold on to and fired. The bullet seared a hot, agonizing path across her shoulder. "Drop the gun!" Pike Boone's voice boomed from below. He was standing in the clear, his pistol aimed squarely at Pike's chest. Rusk, seeing his chance, seeing Boone's attention focused upward, snatched up his fallen pistol. He brought it up, aiming at Boone's back. Alias Maeve screamed, ignoring the fire in her shoulder. She launched herself off the train car. She hit the ground hard, rolling, and slammed into Boone, shoving him out of the way. Rusk's gun went off. The bullet meant for Boone's heart, instead tearing through the flesh of his side, spinning him around before he collapsed to the ground. High above, the two uncoupled cyanide cars were still rolling, carried by their own immense weight, straight toward the now collapsing trestle. But a small, wiry figure scrambled up the ladder on the side of the lead car. It was little Tom. His face was smudged with soot and streaked with tears, but his expression was one of fierce determination. He threw his whole small weight against the handbrake, turning the iron wheel with a strength he did not know he possessed. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the brakes engaged, the wheels locked, showering the tracks with sparks. The heavy cars shuddered, slowed, and finally ground to a halt, their front wheels mere inches from the fiery abyss of the broken trestle. And then, as if the heavens themselves had finally rendered a verdict, the rain came, not a drizzle, but a sudden, biblical deluge, hissing as it hit the fire, turning the orange flames to steam, dousing the burning embers. Rusk stood frozen, stunned by the turn of events, and was quickly surrounded by a group of railroad men who had come to fight the fire. In the chaos, Calder Pike slipped away, melting back into the darkness toward his mill. The world seemed to shrink to a small, damp patch of earth under the dripping pines. Maeve knelt beside Boone. He was conscious, his hand pressed against the new wound in his side. It was bad, but it was not fatal. They looked at each other, the smoke and the rain and the fear all swirling around them. Later, in the cramped, damp confines of a track walker's hut a half-mile down the line, the world was quiet again. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof. A single lantern cast a warm, gentle glow, Maeve had cleaned and bandaged Boone's side as best she could, her movements slow and careful. He was propped against a wall, his breathing shallow but steady. The adrenaline had faded, leaving them both trembling with a cold that came from deep inside. Without a word, she sat down beside him, huddled close, seeking his warmth. He put his good arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed that way for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the shared, exhausted beat of their hearts. The fear, the fire, the violence, it all seemed to be washing away, leaving something new and fragile in its place. She lifted her head, and he looked down at her, his face weary but his eyes full of a profound, quiet emotion she had never seen before. He slowly lowered his head, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not born of passion, but of something deeper relief, gratitude, a shared understanding that went beyond words. It was slow and gentle, a promise in the dark. "When this is all done," he whispered against her lips, his voice hoarse, "when the town knows the truth, we will face them, together, as honest people." The promise hung in the small, warm space, a beacon against the long night that was still to come. Judge Patterson arrived not in a fancy carriage, but on a dust-covered bay mare, looking more like a tired rancher than an arbiter of the law. He was a man with a face carved from granite, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a reputation for being immune to charm, threats, and bad cooking. He did not convene his court in a church or a hall. He chose Nora Dove's saloon, commandeering the largest table and placing his leather satchel upon it with a thud that silenced the nervous chatter of the assembled townsfolk. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, stale beer, and palpable tension. Boone stood before the makeshift bench, his arm in a clean sling, his side tightly bandaged beneath his shirt. He moved with a stiff, painful deliberation, but his voice was clear and steady. Maeve stood beside him, her shoulder aching but her gaze fixed on the judge. They were a study in battered but unbroken resolve. "Your Honor," Boone began, "we are here because a man's greed has threatened to poison this valley, and because he tried to ruin an innocent woman to cover his crimes." Patterson listened, his expression impassive. "Those are strong words. Sheriff, I trust you have more than words to offer." "We do," Boone said. He laid out the collection of forged debt notices he had taken from his office. He placed them beside a legitimate document from the county clerk's office. "You will note the seal on these papers, all filed by Mr. Pike's company, is a crude imitation. The ink is inferior, and the stamp itself is flawed." Nora Dove stepped forward, placing her carefully carved wax replica on the table. "And this, Your Honor, is a copy of the flawed seal, which we believe was used to create these forgeries." Judge Patterson picked up a notice, then the wax seal. Examining them closely through a small pair of spectacles he produced from his waistcoat, he made a non-committal grunt and looked at Boone. "Continue." Dr. Ames was next. He placed a small, cloth-wrapped packet on the table. "This is a sample of a black powder I recovered from the interior of the crate Miss Callahan was hired to transport. A crate that was supposed to contain mining tools, but in fact held stolen Army payroll." He unwrapped the packet. "It is not dirt, Your Honor. It is activated charcoal, and it is saturated with the residue of cyanide. It is my professional opinion that the crate, and therefore the money bags within it, was stored for some time in an area where a cyanide leaching process was being used." A low murmur went through the crowd. Pike's new mill was no secret, nor were the rumors about the dangerous chemicals he was using. Then came little Tom. The boy was visibly trembling as he approached the table, but he clutched the heavy telegraph logbook to his chest as if it were a shield. He looked at Maeve, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He took a deep breath. "Sir, Your Honor," he stammered, placing the book on the table and opening it to a marked page. "The deputy, Mr. Rusk. He said he got a telegram from the district court authorizing an arrest. But there was no such message, not on that day or any day that week. His finger, smudged with ink, traced a line in the book. But there was this, an outgoing message, sent the night before the storm, paid for by Mr. Pike's office. It was sent to a relay station with instructions to route it back here to look like an official wire. Miss Fairchild. She sent it. All eyes in the room turned to Miss Fairchild, who sat pale and rigid in a corner. She rose to her feet, her voice a thin, brittle thing. That is a lie. The boy is confused. It was Deputy Rusk who handled all official communications. He told me what to send. I was merely following the orders of a lawman. Rusk, who was standing in custody between two burly railroad men, lunged forward. "You lying witch! It was your idea. You handled all of Pike's books." Enough. Judge Patterson's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a whip crack. He looked at Boone. "The books, Sheriff. Do you have them?" "We do not," Boone admitted. "But we have reason to believe a second ledger exists, one that details Mr. Pike's private expenditures." He looked directly at the judge. "I request a warrant to search his office and his safe, effective immediately." Judge Patterson stared at Boone for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Granted." While a small party was dispatched to the mining office, the hearing continued. A new, unexpected sound filled the saloon, the shuffling of nervous feet. Nora Dove led 3 men to the front. One was a broad-shouldered Irishman named O'Doyle, his face smudged with the permanent grime of the mines. The other 2 were Chinese laborers, their expressions watchful and guarded. "These men have something to say," Nora said, her voice ringing with defiance. O'Doyle twisted his cap in his hands. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with a brogue. "We was on the night shift. Mr. Pike, he told us to open the sluice gates from the big vats. Late at night, when the town was sleeping. Said it was just wastewater, but it had a smell. And the next morning, there'd be dead fish floating in the creek downstream." The 2 Chinese men spoke next, one of them speaking in clear but heavily accented English, telling the same story of secret nocturnal releases of poisoned water directly into the cottonwood. They had been afraid to speak, they said, but Nora had promised them the law would listen. Just as their testimony concluded, the search party returned. They carried a heavy iron lockbox. The judge ordered it opened. Inside, nestled among stock certificates and deeds, was a second ledger. This one was not written in Miss Fairchild's elegant script, but in Pike's own impatient scrawl. It was all there. Payments to Rusk, payments to the 2 hired guns from the alley, a detailed budget for the acquisition of all land and water rights along the creek, with a final, damning entry, post-contamination acquisition cost estimate. A heavy silence fell over the room. At that moment, the saloon doors swung open. Calder Pike was marched in. His fine suit was torn, and one sleeve was charred from the fire, but his expression was one of supreme arrogance. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "A circus of lies concocted by a hysterical female and a half-competent sheriff." Judge Patterson did not even look at him. He was reading the final entry in the ledger. He closed the book slowly. He looked up, and his gaze finally settled on Calder Pike. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice cold as a winter grave, "based on the evidence and testimony presented here, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, theft of federal property, and the willful contamination of a public waterway. You will be held without bond and transported to the state capitol for trial." He then turned his attention to Maeve. "All charges and warrants against Miss Maeve Callahan are hereby dismissed with prejudice." He looked at Boone. "Sheriff, you submitted your resignation. It has been denied. This town needs you." A collective sigh of relief went through the room, followed by a smattering of applause as Pike and a now sobbing Rusk were led away. Dr. Ames leaned over to Nora. "I maintain," he said in a stage whisper that carried through the room, that the judge is far more agreeable after a bowl of your beef stew. Judge Patterson, who was gathering his papers, paused and cleared his throat. "Let the record show," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth, that the stew in question had a significant and positive impact on the spirit of cooperation. A wave of laughter, genuine and cleansing, swept through the saloon, washing away the last of the tension. In the days that followed, the consequences settled like dust. Rusk, facing a mountain of evidence, confessed everything and received a lengthy prison sentence. Miss Fairchild, in exchange for her full cooperation, was given a much lighter term. Calder Pike's assets were seized by the federal government. Judge Patterson, true to his word, ordered the creation of the Cottonwood Creek Remediation Fund, a trust to be used for the sole purpose of cleaning the poisoned water. A week later, Maeve stood on the banks of the Cottonwood. The water, which had once run clear and sweet, was still a murky, sullen brown. The legal battle had been won, the villains brought to justice. But as she looked at the wounded river, she knew the fight was far from over. The path ahead was still long, and the water was not yet clean. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but the wheels of a freight wagon, Maeve Callahan had decided, could turn a bit faster. In the month that followed the trial, a new energy took hold of Juniper Gap. It was a fragile thing, born of shared crisis and relief, but it was real. The fear that had held the town in its grip had been replaced by a quiet, determined bustle. Maeve did not buy her patch of land by the Cottonwood. Not yet. The water was still healing, and she felt it would be wrong to claim it before it was whole again. Instead, she used a loan from the bank, whose president was suddenly eager to be on the right side of public opinion, to purchase a large, dilapidated warehouse near the railroad depot that had belonged to one of Pike's foreclosed businesses. The first thing she did was paint a sign. It took her 3 days, working on 2 long planks of pine set on sawhorses. The letters were not fancy, but they were bold and clear, painted in a deep, defiant blue. When she was finished, she, O'Doyle, and the 2 Chinese men she had hired, Li Wei and Bao, hoisted it up over the big double doors. It read, "Callahan Freight and Livery." And underneath, in smaller, but no less firm letters, "Water first, profit second." Her crew was a strange sight for Juniper Gap. She had O'Doyle, whose testimony had helped seal Pike's fate, managing the livery side of the business. Li Wei and Bao, who had proven to be meticulous and hard-working, were in charge of the freight manifests and loading. She hired a few other out-of-work miners, and a young Mexican family who had lost their small ranch to one of Pike's forged debt notices. The pay was not much to start, but it was fair, and it was honest. Anyone who wants to see this water run clean has a place here, she had told them, and she meant it. Their first contracts were not hauling ore or supplies, but equipment for the remediation crews that had begun the slow, arduous work of cleaning the creek. Callahan Freight was hauling hope. Sheriff Ellis Boone, meanwhile, was rebuilding in his own way. He had seen how close the town had come to being ruled by a man who used the law as a cudgel. He was determined that would never happen again. His office was no longer a place of quiet waiting, but of quiet action. He met with the town's merchants and ranchers and organized a volunteer night watch. "This is not a posse," he told the dozen men gathered in his office one evening, the lamplight casting long shadows on their weathered faces. "We are not looking for trouble. We are looking out for each other. One man with a badge is just a target, a dozen neighbors watching their own street. That is a community. We will be firm, but we will be gentle. A quiet word is always better than a drawn gun." He was changing the very definition of what it meant to keep the peace in Juniper Gap. It was not about punishing the wicked. It was about protecting the good, about building something strong enough to withstand the next Calder Pike that came down the road. Justice, he was coming to believe, was not just a verdict hammered out by a judge. It was the daily work of building a decent place to live. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft violet. Maeve found him on the grassy rise overlooking the town, near the old horse barn that had once been their sanctuary. He was standing there, his arm out of the sling now, just watching the lights begin to twinkle on in the valley below. She came and stood beside him, following his gaze. From up here, the town looked small and peaceful. The ugly scars on the land were softened by the twilight. The hammering from her new livery had ceased for the day, and the only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. "It is quiet," she said. "For now," he answered, a small, tired smile on his face. He turned to look at her, his eyes warm in the fading light. He had watched her these past weeks, watched her build her strange, wonderful crew, watched her work with a fierce joy that was a world away from the angry defiance he had first seen. "If you were 2 parts less stubborn, I would worry," he said, his voice a low, gentle tease. Maeve laughed, a soft, easy sound. "If you were 2 parts less gentle." "Sheriff," she countered, her eyes sparkling, "the whole town would worry." Their laughter mingled in the quiet air, a comfortable, shared sound. The space between them, which had once been filled with suspicion and pride, was now filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and strong, her smaller, calloused one fitting easily into his. "No matter if they say you are too stubborn, too arrogant," he said, his voice serious now, sincere, "this sheriff will always know you are the tenderest soul he knew." She did not pull her hand away. She did not bristle at the intimacy of the words. She simply held his hand a little tighter and looked out over the valley that they had, together, fought for. They did not talk of leaving, of finding an easier place to make a life. Their roots were here now, sunk deep into the wounded but resilient soil of Juniper Gap. They would stay, they would work, and they would watch, and they would wait for the day the water of Cottonwood Creek finally ran clear again. The path ahead was still long, but, for the first time, it did not feel lonely. As they stood there, a rumor that had been whispering through the territory for weeks felt a little more real talk of a new great highway, a wide artery of commerce and progress, that might just be surveyed to run right through the heart of their valley, bringing with it a whole new set of promises and a whole new set of challenges. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.